Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress. Only 36 days now till the World Championship match between Carlsen and Caruana will start on November 9th in London. On Chess to Impress we continue the countdown towards this great event, which is the 47th event in the history of the undisputed and official World Championship. On Chess to Impress we're looking at the first 46 events, and we have arrived at a very important year in chess, 1972. Where the world champion from the Soviet Union, Boris Spassky, defended his title against the American Bobby Fischer. How did this match come about? The interzonal tournament was held in Palma de Mallorca in Spain at the end of 1970. The top 6 players of that event would qualify for the candidates tournament. 2 players had already qualified, Tigran Petrosyan, the dethroned world champion, and Viktor Korchnoi, who had finished second in the previous candidates tournament. Bobby Fischer had not qualified to play in the interzonal tournament as he had not participated in the 1969 US Championships, which was the zonal tournament for that part of the world. But Paul Benko gave up his spot, and FIDE, the World Chess Organization, allowed Fischer to participate instead of Benko. A compensation of $1,500 was paid to Benko for this. And these are the results of this interzonal tournament, and Fischer won it. 3.5 points ahead of Larsen, Geller and Hübner, and Taimanov and Ullmann also qualified for the candidates tournament. These were the candidates matches, and it is still astounding to see those 6-0 results there in this table. Fischer beat Taimanov in the quarterfinals 6-0, Larsen beat Ullmann, Korchnoi beat Geller, and Petrosyan beat Hübner. That match had a strange finish. It was 4-3 to Petrosyan when Hübner forfeited the match. He was not happy with the noise levels. It's a bit of a Bobby Fischer action, walking away from an event. In the semi-finals, Fischer beat Larsen again 6-0, incredible. And Tigran Petrosyan just beat Viktor Korchnoi 5.5, 4.5. In the final, Fischer beat Petrosyan handily enough 6.5, 2.5, and he qualified for the World Championship match against Spassky. The first time a non-Soviet player was involved in the World Championship match since 1948. This is my favorite picture from the match. On the left, world champion Spassky, on the right, a challenger Fischer. And what a match it was! It all started before one move was played, with Fischer not showing up on time. The match was held in Reykjavik in Iceland, in the geographical middle between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And when Fischer finally showed up, he played that incredible bishop takes h2 blunder in the first game. He did not show up for the second game because the cameras were distracting him. He was forfeited for that game. Spassky led 2-0. Then they played away from the stage in a small ping-pong room, and Fischer won the third game. The fourth game was a draw, and in this video we're going to look at game 5. The score was 2.5, 1.5 in Spassky's favor. Spassky played with the white pieces, Fischer was black. It's the 20th of July 1972. d4 from Spassky, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and we have a Nimzo Indian. Knight f3. In this video I make use of the analysis of Dutch Grandmaster Jan Timman in his book on the match Fischer World Champion. And Timman says here, Spassky often plays the Nimzo Indian like this. He waits playing e2, e3 to keep the option of bishop g5 in the position. So knight f3 was played on the fourth move by Spassky. c5, typical move in the Nimzo Indian. Now e3, knight c6, bishop d3, and Fischer voluntarily takes the knight without waiting for that bishop to be kicked with a2, a3. Timman writes, black voluntarily exchanges his bishop in order to damage white's pawn structure. The tempo loss does not count for much in this close position that will arise. Spassky took back, and d6. e4, which was the most popular move at that time. White is planning to immediately close the center. e5, and Spassky closes the center indeed with d5. Knight jumps back, knight h4, with the idea of bishop g5 and f4, as explained by Grandmaster Keen in his book. And that's why Fischer played h6 to keep the bishop out of g5. f4 from Spassky, and Timon writes that f3 was more common at the time, and he gives this variation g5, knight to f5, and that is taken with the bishop, e takes, and in 1972 the grandmasters had divided opinions on this position, writes Timon. In this closed position the bishop pair is a disadvantage, and white has also doubled c-pawns. On the other hand, he has good perspectives of breaking with h4. So different opinions about the position after f3, but as said, Spassky played f4, and he had spent quite a bit of time on this move, so it was not clear if this was part of his preparation or if he found this move over the board. Fischer played knight g6, and Timon writes that the main purpose of this move is to keep the position closed and to stop white's bishop pair to become active. It's important to see that black cannot win a piece here with e takes f4 instead of knight g6. Bishop takes f4, and then you think, okay, black can win a piece with g5, forking those two pieces. But then white can play e5 and gets an advantage. Timon gives this variation, knight back to d7, e takes d6, attacking the other knight, knight g8, then white gives a check, king steps aside, and bishop e5. Knight takes, queen takes, and because the rook is hanging in the corner, black does not have time to take that piece. So black cannot win a piece. Knight g6 played by Fischer. Spassky took on g6, f takes, and f takes e5, which gets a question mark from Jan Timon. He said that white should have castled, then black castles, and then either queen e1 or h3. He did not like the capture on e5. And Grandmaster Keen in this book also does not like the move f takes e5. After d takes e5 he writes, Spassky must have been on unfamiliar ground. The passed d-pawn is without value in the middle game. Indeed, there's a real danger that black will be able to post a knight on d6 immediately in front of the pawn with pressure on c4 and e4. So if black gets a knight there, then he will be pressuring these two pawns. D takes e5, and now bishop e3, which Timon calls not a bad move, but white could have castled first before committing his bishop to this square. 7 moves later we'll see that bishop going back to d2, so bishop e3 indeed seems premature. It's attacking the pawn on c5. Fischer defended that pawn with b6. Now both players castled, and Spassky played a4, which Timon calls a positional mistake, as white's a-pawn becomes weaker than black's b-pawn, as we'll see. Fischer played a5, and now this pawn turns out to be weaker than this one. Both players are attacking the opponent's weakness with rook b1 and bishop d7. Rook b2, rook b8, and rook b2 f2, switching the rook over to the king side. This move was condemned by the grandmasters at that time. They felt that white should have maintained the pressure against the only weak point in black's position, which is the b6 pawn. He could have done that by playing bishop c2 instead, to make sure the pawn keeps protection, and then queen b1 to put pressure on the b6 pawn. But rook bf2 was played by Spassky. Fischer played queen e7, bishop c2, g5, bishop d2. There we see that bishop that had gone to e3 prematurely, now moving back to d2 on its way to e1. And queen e8, rerouting the queen to g6. That's a very nice square there for the queen. Bishop e1, and there goes that queen to g6. It's ideally placed there. It puts pressure on e4, it keeps an eye on the weak pawn on b6 if the knight goes, and it supports the advance of black's kingside pawns. Black's pawn majority on the king side fulfills a useful function, that is, it keeps the white bishop on e1 out of play, as Jan Timon explains. Spassky played queen d3, and he would love to play his queen to g3. That's a nice square. Fischer prevents that with knight h5. also eyeing up the nice square on f4 for the knight. 4 rooks were swapped off, and here Spassky played bishop d1. Other suggestions were that he could have played g3 to keep the knight out of f4, but that leaves this bishop very passive. Another option is to play bishop g3, but a knight f4, and this is also nice for black. Bishop d1 was played in the game, threatening to take off that knight, swap the knight for the bishop, and Fischer prevents that by playing knight f4, hitting the queen. Here queen b1 is the right move, and then g4 is black's best reply according to Timon, who says white's situation becomes precarious. Black's king can walk to c7 to protect the weak b6 pawn, but white often can parry subsequent attacks against his weak pawns by regrouping his pieces. And Timon says, I will have to leave the question of whether the position is a draw or a win for black unresolved. Nowadays we have the engine, and the engine thinks this is an equal position, but black has practical chances here. White has to defend. So all that after the correct move, queen b1, but Spassky blundered. He played the queen to c2, and that's a blunder because of a tactical possibility that black now has, and Fischer found it. He played bishop takes a4, and that must have come as a big shock to Spassky. It wins on the spot, and Spassky resigned. Because if you take that bishop, take the piece, then you get checkmated with white. Queen takes e4 with checkmate threat on e1 and on g2. And there's nothing you can do against that. It's a forced checkmate. Let's look at one variation. King f2 to try and run away. Knight d3 check. King g3. Queen h4 check. King f3. Another check. White only has one move, and then a beautiful checkmate move, knight c1. The queen taking all the squares away apart from these two light squares that are taken away by the knight. Nice checkmating variation. So taking the bishop leads to checkmate. What if we play queen b1? That also wins for black because of bishop takes, queen takes, and again the queen comes into e4 with a checkmate threat on g2. Queen d2 to defend against the checkmate, but then the a pawn starts running. White can try and run with his d pawn, but the king is close enough, and black wins. Just to show variation, let's play up the h pawn. There comes a3, h takes g5, and now black can finish the game by taking on g2, queen takes, knight takes, king takes, and the a pawn is unstoppable. Black will get a new queen and will win this game. So Fischer was back in this match. He was 2-0 down after 2 games with a blunder in game 1 and not showing up for game 2. He won game 3, game 4 was a draw, and after this game the score was 2.5, 2.5. And as you can see, Fischer also won game 6. That is a famous game where Spassky applauded his opponent after the game. Fischer went on to win game 8, game 10. Spassky hit back in game 11. Fischer won game 13, and then a series of draws. Fischer won the last game, and after 21 games he had the 12.5 points. And Bobby Fischer was the 11th official and undisputed world champion. And as the story goes, at that time he was the most famous man on the planet. And here's a quote from Kasparov from 2016. He said, "In the Soviet Union, chess was treated by the Soviet authorities as a very important and useful ideological tool to demonstrate the intellectual superiority of the Soviet communist regime over the decadent West. That's why the Spassky defeat was treated by people on both sides of the Atlantic as a crushing moment in the midst of the Cold War." But as we all know, this story has a sad end. To give a quote from the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, Bobby made the most unexpected move he ever played. He disappeared. He had the world at his feet and could earn millions by playing chess and by appearing in television shows, by doing advertisements. But Fischer was fighting the demons in his head, and at the age of 29 he stepped away from the chess world and did not defend his title in 1975 against the Soviet Anatoly Karpov. So there was no World Championship match in 1975. Karpov was awarded the title, as Fischer did not agree to the match conditions. So the next match for the World Championship was in 1978, when Anatoly Karpov defended his title against Viktor Korchnoi. That was also quite a story, which I will tell you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel and please leave a comment. If you liked the video and this series, it would be great if you could share it on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. The link to the series is here. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.